Hermann von François was one of Germany's most aggressive infantry generals of World War I, feared by the Allies for his strategic maneuvers, refusal to retreat, and ability to turn defensive situations into crushing victories. At the outbreak of war, his task was to defend East Prussia against the Russian invasion. When ordered to withdraw before Paul von Rennenkampf's First Army, François replied that he would retreat only after defeating the Russians. He then struck first at the Battle of Stallupönen, inflicting heavy losses and stalling the Russian advance. Distrusted by Hindenburg and Ludendorff for his disobedience, François again ignored orders at Tannenberg. His corps attacked deeper into the Russian rear than instructed, playing the decisive role in the surprise encirclement and destruction of General Samsonov's Second Army. The result was one of Germany's most famous victories, with tens of thousands of prisoners taken and Samsonov himself driven to take his life. The next month, François led his troops at the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, where another devastating defeat expelled the Russians from East Prussia. Later sidelined for repeatedly disobeying orders, he was soon reinstated and honored with the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration, for his role in the breakthrough at Gorlice in 1915. Later transferred to the Western Front, he earned oak leaves to his medal for his performance at Verdun in 1917. Paul von Hindenburg became one of Germany's most famous commanders of the First World War, remembered less for tactical brilliance than for his calm authority and the victories achieved under his leadership. A veteran of the wars of 1866 and 70, he already had battlefield experience before 1914, when he was recalled from retirement to command the 8th Army in East Prussia. Together with Erich Ludendorff, he delivered crushing victories at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, destroying Russia's Second Army, capturing 92,000 men and forcing Rennenkampf's First Army to retreat with heavy losses. Within 6 weeks, the Russians had lost more than 300,000 men. These results earned Hindenburg the title Hero of Tannenberg and made him a legendary figure. Though Ludendorff was the real strategist, Hindenburg provided steadiness and inspiration. He relied on concentrated strikes rather than frontal assaults, which allowed his armies to pocket Russian forces. After Tannenberg, he led further victories, including the defense of Silesia and the Battle of Lodz. His string of successes on the Eastern Front made him one of the Allies' most feared opponents. By 1916, his popularity was so great that he replaced Falkenhayn as chief of the general staff. Alongside Ludendorff, he forced Russia out of the war and launched new offensives in the West. However, his leadership also oversaw the decision for unrestricted submarine warfare, which brought the United States into the conflict. After Germany's defeats in 1918, his military reputation remained intact. He later enabled Hitler's rise by appointing him Chancellor in 1933. Erich Ludendorff first gained fame at the Battle of Liège in 1914, where he led the successful assault that captured the city and its citadel. For this, he received the Pour le Mérite. Soon after, he became Hindenburg's chief of staff and the main architect of the victory at Tannenberg, where the Russian Second Army was encircled and destroyed. He also directed operations at the Vistula River, Lodz, and the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes, where his maneuvers inflicted huge losses on Russian forces and secured East Prussia. By 1915, Ludendorff oversaw German occupation of vast territories in Eastern Europe, pushing for annexations and colonization. In 1916, he was effectively co-ruling Germany with Hindenburg. He turned his attention to the Western Front, ordering the construction of the Hindenburg Line, a massive fortified defense system designed to save manpower after the costly battles of Verdun and the Somme. He also directed the defense at Passchendaele, where British forces eventually captured the ridge at heavy cost. Ludendorff was known for his aggressive leadership and his skill to reorganize defenses and launch surprise offensives, but his power also tied him to Germany's ultimate failures. In 1918, the Allies broke through at Amiens. He called it the Black Day of the German Army. Soon after, he admitted to the Kaiser that Germany could no longer hold the Western Front, leading to calls for an armistice and his forced resignation. After the war, he fueled the stab in the back myth, blaming Germany's defeat on internal betrayal rather than military failure. He later took part in the Kapp Putsch and Hitler's Beer Hall Putsch, helping pave the way for the rise of the National Socialists. Erwin Rommel, later famous in World War II, had already built a fearsome reputation during World War I. He fought in France, Romania, and especially Italy, where his bold tactics unsettled the Allies. His style relied on speed, surprise, and flanking. Instead of frontal assaults, Rommel used covering fire to break into enemy lines, then rapidly maneuvered to their rear, forcing large surrenders with minimal losses. Early in the war, he earned the Iron Cross for aggressive actions at Verdun, and by 1917, his mountain battalion was achieving decisive results. At the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, Rommel led 150 men to capture 9,000 Italians, while losing only 36 men. He repeatedly ignored orders to hold back, instead striking from unexpected directions to outflank entrenched troops. His small battalion later forced 10,000 Italians to surrender, earning him the Pour le Mérite. Rommel's pioneering use of infiltration tactics, attacking weak points and exploiting terrain, foreshadowed the maneuver warfare he would later perfect. August von Mackensen was one of Germany's most effective commanders of World War I, a veteran of the elite Death's Head Hussars. He entered the war at age 65, leading the 17th Army Corps in East Prussia. His first major action at Gumbinnen in August 1914 ended in disaster, with 9,000 losses in 2 hours from a frontal assault. But he quickly redeemed himself at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, helping encircle Russian armies and drive them out of East Prussia. By late 1914, he earned the Pour le Mérite for victories around Warsaw and Lodz. And in 1915, he was given command of the 11th Army with Hans von Siegt as chief of staff. Together they planned the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, which smashed Russian lines, recaptured Lemberg, and pushed the Russians back, making Mackensen a national hero. Later that year he was tasked with conquering Serbia, and after Belgrade fell, he was ennobled. When Romania entered the war in 1916, Mackensen led a mixed force of German, Austro-Hungarian, Bulgarian and Ottoman troops. On his 67th birthday, his forces captured Bucharest, leaving most of Romania under his control. Mackensen believed in harsh peace terms for Germany's enemies and supported unrestricted submarine warfare. He was involved in a counter-offensive in Macedonia at the end of September 1918, even as the German High Command acknowledged the war was lost. After the armistice, he was interned in Serbia, retiring in 1920 rather than serving the new democratic government. Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, known as the Lion of Africa, commanded German forces in East Africa. From the outset, he realized that the colony was only a secondary theater. His plan was simple: tie down as many Allied troops as possible, keeping them away from the Western Front. With only 3,000 Germans and 11,000 African Askari, he faced an enemy force of over 300,000 British, Indian, Belgian and Portuguese soldiers. After winning the Battle of Yasin in 1915, he avoided direct engagements, relying instead on mobility, ambushes and outflanking maneuvers. When German East Africa fell in 1917, he withdrew into Portuguese East Africa, defeating Portuguese forces before returning to German territory and scoring another victory at Mahiva. His campaign lasted 4 years, and he was never defeated or captured, making him the only German commander to successfully invade and hold part of the British Empire during the war. Returning to Berlin in 1919, he was celebrated as the last German soldier to lay down arms. Later, he became a symbol for German colonial revisionists, advocating the restoration of Germany's overseas empire. Though he shared racist and anti-Semitic views, he never joined the Nazi Party and personally despised Hitler, even rudely refusing an ambassadorship to Britain. Maximilian von Spee was a German naval officer who was responsible for defending Germany's colonies and bases in East Asia and the South Pacific. When war broke out, he was isolated in the Pacific, heavily outnumbered and cut off from resupply. Yet, he managed to lead his squadron across thousands of miles while striking blows against the Allies. In 1914, Spee won a decisive victory at the Battle of Coronel, off the coast of Chile. His squadron sank 2 British cruisers while suffering only 3 wounded. This was the first major British naval defeat in more than a century, shocking the Royal Navy and forcing them to dispatch battle cruisers to hunt him down. In December 1914, Spee decided to attack Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands, unaware that British reinforcements had just arrived. In the ensuing battle, his flagship Scharnhorst, along with Gneisenau, Leipzig and Nuremberg, was sunk with over 2,200 German sailors killed, including Spee and his two sons. Monuments in both Germany and Chile honor his legacy. Max Hoffmann led the German 8th Army and was one of the sharpest military strategists of the war. He understood Russian tactics better than almost anyone, which made him indispensable on the Eastern Front. At Tannberg in August 1914, Hoffmann was the true architect of the German plan. He proposed shifting most of the 8th Army south to strike the exposed flank of Samsonov's 2nd Army. This strategy exploited Russia's poor coordination and led to the destruction of his forces. The victory made Hindenburg and Ludendorff famous, but it was Hoffmann's foresight and planning that made it possible. He repeated this success at the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, where his mobility-focused and circlement-based tactics drove the Russians out. Later, with the 9th Army, Hoffmann helped outflank Russian forces at Lodz, ending the threat to Silesia. In 1915, his operations pushed Russian armies back further, completing the liberation of East Prussia and securing the Baltic provinces, though High Command shifted the main offensive south to Gorlice-Tarnów, where combined Austro-German forces defeated the Russians. Later, he negotiated the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, forcing the Russians to surrender Ukraine, Belarus and the Baltic states. His plans led to 2 million Russian casualties across 1914 to 15. Rupprecht Ferdinand, Crown Prince of Bavaria, was the last heir to the Bavarian throne and one of Germany's steadiest commanders on the Western Front. He took charge of the 6th Army in 1913 and led it into action at the battles of the frontiers in August 1914. He was tasked with holding the northern sector against the British, whom he considered Germany's most dangerous enemy. For years he fought them in some of the war's worst battles, including Ypres, Arras and the Somme, earning from the British the nickname Bloody Rupprecht. He described himself as the Anvil of the West, stressing his role in defending massive Allied attacks. In August 1916 he was promoted to lead Army Group Rupprecht, which faced the British Expeditionary Force and endured the grinding stalemate that followed. The British feared his fortified lines and tactical retreats, which bled their offensives dry. Rupprecht was also a critic of Ludendorff's methods. He opposed the scorched earth tactics and forced labor policies in occupied territories, and he was alarmed by Ludendorff's 1918 spring offensive, which he saw as wasteful with no clear objectives. Convinced the war could not be won by military means alone, he advocated for diplomacy to divide the Allies, though these efforts failed. Georg von der Marwitz was a Prussian cavalry officer who rose to high command in World War I. He earned the Pour le Mérite for his role in the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes and later fought alongside Austria-Hungary against Russia on the Eastern Front. In 1916 he returned west to command the Second Army, where he became best known for the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917. The British launched the largest tank assault of the war, but Marwitz, coordinating with Rupprecht, organized a counter-offensive that blunted the attack. His stormtroopers destroyed hundreds of tanks and recaptured ground. During the Great German Offensive of spring 1918, Marwitz's Second Army achieved the deepest gains, exploiting the gap between French and British forces. The advance only stalled at Villers-Bretonneux, where hastily deployed Australian units halted the breakthrough. For the rest of the year he held a critical defense line, but by September was moved to command the Fifth Army during the Meuse-Argonne battles. Facing the overwhelming Franco-American forces supported by tanks, Marwitz struggled with exhausted divisions. He urged retreat, but High Command ordered him to stand fast. By early November 1918, his lines had collapsed at Baricourt Heights and he admitted the war was lost. Fritz von Below was one of Germany's key defensive commanders on the Western Front. In 1916, he led the Second Army during the Battle of the Somme, where his men endured the heaviest artillery bombardment of the war, with over 1.5 million shells fired by the Allies. Von Below's defensive tactics prevented a full breakthrough, and although the Allies gained ground, their massive losses far outweighed their limited success. His ability to hold the line earned him the oak leaves to the Pour le Mérite. He later commanded German forces during the Second Battle of the Aisne in 1917, when French commander Robert Nivelle launched an offensive meant to shatter the German front. Von Below's forces absorbed the assault, inflicting such high casualties that French morale collapsed, triggering widespread mutinies across the French army. In June 1918, he was given the command of the 9th Army, but illness left him unable to continue. Friedrich Sixt von Armin's career was defined by some of the hardest fighting on the Western Front. He first gained recognition leading the 4th Army Corps through Belgium in 1914, clashing with the British at Mons and Le Cateau, before taking part in the Marne and the early trench battles around Arras and Loos. By the Battle of the Somme in 1916, his steady leadership under massive pressure earned him the Pour le Mérite. In March 1917, he was appointed commander of the German 4th Army in Flanders, a sector that became one of the bloodiest of the war. He directed defenses at Meucine and the Third Battle of Ypres, where his troops resisted months of relentless Allied attacks in the mud of Passchendaele. In April 1918, during the Battle of the Lys, his army overran Portuguese and British lines, capturing thousands of prisoners. But by late 1918, his army was exhausted, losing the Flanders coast and key submarine bases before falling back to defensive positions until the armistice. Georg Bruchmüller, nicknamed Durchbruchmüller, a combination of the German word for breakthrough and his name, was the artillery mastermind who reshaped modern warfare with his firestorm tactics. Recalled to service at the start of the Great War, he quickly proved his worth on the Eastern Front. First at Lake Norwich in 1916, where he introduced centralized artillery command and creeping barrages that shattered Russian attacks. His success earned him the Pour le Mérite in 1917. Bruchmüller perfected the idea of short, devastating hurricane bombardments, striking deep into enemy positions, shifting fire rapidly, and then unleashing creeping barrages that shielded advancing infantry. He put these methods into practice at Tarnopol, Riga, and later on the Western Front, where his techniques were taught to German artillery and infantry ahead of the 1918 spring offensive. At Riga, his fire plan enabled General Oskar von Hutier's breakthrough, while in 1918 his barrages inflicted massive Allied losses. Bruchmüller became one of the most feared figures of the war, as his firestorms made defenses collapse before the infantry even arrived. Praised by Ludendorff, he was later called the greatest artillery expert of the war by British historians. Oskar von Hutier, or Hutier's reputation was made at Riga in September 1917, where he worked in perfect synergy with Georg Bruchmüller's hurricane bombardments. The assault began with a devastating artillery plan that used gas and high explosives to paralyze Russian defenses, followed by stormtrooper squads armed with machine guns, grenades and flamethrowers who bypassed strongpoints to strike deep behind the lines. Within hours, the Germans had crossed the Dwina River and captured Riga, the fourth largest city in Russia, with minimal losses. For this victory, Hutier received the Pour le Mérite. Transferred to the Western Front in 1918, he commanded the newly formed 18th Army during Operation Michael, the opening of the German spring offensive. Using the same infiltration methods, his forces swarmed the British 5th Army and took 50,000 prisoners. Though later offensives stalled, Hutier's name remained tied to the revolutionary combination of stormtrooper assaults and Bruchmüller's artillery fire plans.